we have Sarah Yates, who used to work with Greenpeace, and now she works for NZEI. She has an absolute wealth of experience as an organizer, an activist, a mobilizer, and a local campaigner. Lots of great stories to share, no doubt. But she definitely holds a particular passion and has heaps of expertise in the area of running and supporting local campaigns, which is why we asked her if she would please run a session on them for one of these. You might actually have seen her or worked with her. I know some of you have definitely worked with her when she was working with Greenpeace, and it sounds like some of you now work with her at NZEI. Lucky ducks, we miss her a lot. So we're really stoked to have you, Sarah, and I'll hand it over to you.
Hi everyone. I'm just going to share my screen with you, so just bear with me. So can you all see my screen? Yeah, great. Kia ora koutou, ko Sarah Yates tako ingoa. As Abby said, I used to work at Greenpeace New Zealand as an engagement specialist, and I worked with Abby and others around building and implementing plans that empowered people to join us and fight with us. Before that, I worked at Greenpeace Australia as an activist coordinator, so working in the actions team, and now I am a field officer at NZEI. Just trying to get rid of the people on my screen. So today I'm just going to talk to you about the power of distributed campaigns, and I see that I've lost my C in campaigns. I think basically distributed campaigning is essentially about people power. It's about organisations asking ourselves, how can we better work with communities on the things that we care about? And as an organisation, as you know, all organisations, we never have enough time or resources to do the things. And as activists or grassroots activists on the ground, we also know we can't win without people. And we need to work together if we want a better world. So this slide is basically the difference between a centralized campaign and distributed campaign. So you're probably quite familiar with a centralized campaign would be, say, the organization or a small group of people sitting at the top, basically telling other people what they can be doing to be engaged. A distributed campaign is putting either the organization or the campaign issue and people at the center of the campaign, and us working with people in a more distributed way. So instead of waiting for the organization or some people at the top telling people what they should be doing, it's people on the ground working with the organization or us working together more and sharing our knowledge and resources. As I said before, we can't win campaigns, or we can't win or make the world a better place without us working together and finding ways for more people to get engaged and come on board. Whether that's people who care about an issue and haven't done anything besides signing a petition and getting them more engaged, or a long-term activist who is super engaged. How can we keep upskilling people and finding ways to bring new people on board to fight the good fight? I'm just going to try and sort my screen out because it's driving me a little bit nuts. So I'm still having trouble with my screen, but I'll just keep going. So today I'm just going to go through several steps of what putting a distributed campaign would involve. I geek out on this stuff quite a bit, So I'm going to connect it to a campaign Greenpeace launched in 2016 and talk about what we did with local communities. So in 2016, Greenpeace launched a campaign calling on the government to stop funding bigger irrigation schemes, because these schemes were polluting our waterways and they were facilitating the intensification of the dairy industry, and the government was funding them. We knew if we could withdraw that funding, most of these schemes would more than likely fall over. But we also knew that this is quite different to our normal campaigns, and we were going to have to work with local communities to be able to win this. And sometimes they were going to be a lot more conservative than the normal, I guess, Greenpeace population. So we needed to build relationships with them to win this campaign. So this picture is an image of irrigation schemes planned across the country. So straight away we can see that at a national level, we can put pressure on the government to stop funding these schemes. But at a local level, there was plenty for local communities to be doing. So we reached out, we figured out who in those communities already cared about those issues and how we can get behind them and support them. The other thing we found out through the research and when we met local communities and people working on these issues is that local councils were also funding these schemes. So there was the national funding and then there was local funding. So if we could work with communities to put pressure on local councils to stop funding these schemes, these were going to help the overall goal. This took time, and it meant visiting a lot of these communities and going down and building relationships. And if they didn't have leaders, we needed to find ways to upskill people to feel more comfortable to campaign on these issues. A lot of what we did was encourage them to go along to council meetings and ask questions, because as you know, in New Zealand, we have quite a low participation rate in local body elections, and a lot of people don't particularly care about what their local councils are doing. In this case, they weren't only funding the schemes, a lot of these councils were signing up, giving these schemes the go ahead. So they were signing it off, they had the power to stop it, and we needed to make sure the communities knew that they weren't going to be getting voted in if they kept funding these schemes. The area we started in initially was a Aotearoa dam scheme, and coming up to the local body elections, which was 2 elections ago, it was mainly a pro dam council, and we knew that we needed to get anti-dam council members in there if we wanted the scheme to fall over. So we worked with the local communities, we went down there several times, and at the election they got an anti-dam councillors put in place, and the scheme is no longer getting funded by that council. The reason we also targeted this local scheme is because we wanted, we wanted that scheme to fall over, is because we wanted to show the other schemes that were going ahead that we were going to go after them next and that we could win. Because in the beginning, they didn't take us seriously and they didn't think that we could be as powerful as we could. We would have not won that scheme without working with locals in that community. Is there any questions so far, or should I keep going? I'll keep going. Okay, so if I take a step back from what we were doing in the communities, we needed to look at building pathways and roles before we just leaped in. If we just turned up and said, hey, this is what we want to do, it wasn't going to work out. We had to listen, we had to plan things out, and we had to figure out how we were going to bring our members into what those local issues were. Because again, remember, we needed to build that local power to keep putting pressure on the local governments and the national governments. So one thing I see lots of organisations forget to do or don't put as much time into, or grassroots groups, is that we just jump straight into tactics rather than really thinking about what our engagement journey looks like for either members or activists or people who care about the same issue. So one thing I do, and anyone who's worked with me knows I totally geek out on this, I map out what the engagement journey looks like. So how do we get people who have taken maybe their first action, signed a petition, how do we get them to take more steps and engage in whatever the issue is? And also, how do we get local people to, locals who are already really active to upskill? One thing that we did is that we ran a distributed online petition campaign. So we worked with locals to build up their own list by running campaigns directly against their councils. And that way they got to, our supporters got to feed into what that local issue is. So instead of, say, the Greenpeace supporters just waiting for Greenpeace to tell them what they should do next, they can start networking at a local level and build power there without necessarily having to wait for the big organisation to tell them what to do. The next phase of building a distributed campaign is establishing and recruiting a recruitment and onboarding process. So as I mentioned, it's not just about potentially working with that local community, but how can we help those people in that community become more active and also get more people involved? As everyone online here already knows, it's usually a small group of really committed people doing heaps of work, and we need to find ways to bring new people into those groups and find ways for them to connect. So something that big organisations can do is we usually have really big lists of members or supporters or whatever you want to call them. How do we get them more active in what's happening at a local level? The reason I have this slide up is because on the right you can see a petition that we worked with a local group to create, which was putting pressure on the Mackenzie District Council, who had the power to sign up some of the resource consents. We wanted something to happen at a local level. We wanted them to also put pressure on one of the owners of this scheme. So we came up with the idea with the locals, not us just telling them what they should be doing, to organise a protest. Then, when I'm saying we, I'm talking about Greenpeace, then we asked Greenpeace supporters if they wanted to sign this petition. So we're getting our supporters engaged in a local issue, not just the national issue. We knew the Mackenzie campaign was a national and even an international issue. We had people all around the world talking about it, but we really wanted to grow the community in Dunedin. We wanted to draw our members into that community so they could get more people on board and fighting this fight. So there were a couple asks in the area. You could either sign the petition, you could turn up to the protest, or if you wanted to help out, you could also hand out flyers. So there were lots of asks at lots of different levels. Again, building a distributed campaign is about finding ways to bring people in at every single possible opportunity. So people can, as I said, sign the petition, turn up to the protest, hand out flyers, get more engaged with the local community. I am just going to play a little video, so just bear with me while I bring that up. If you guys have any questions, just while I bring the video up, you can go for it.
There's a question from Lisa that I can read out.
Yeah.
And the question is, how did you find the supporters in the areas?
Cool question. So to find supporters in the areas, we would have looked at what our database. So we gathered lots of information. So we had the national campaign, which was calling on the government to stop funding big irrigation. And we took that data and figured out who lived in that local community. So for the Save the Mackenzie, we broke it down to people who lived in that region. And then we asked them to sign a local campaign, and we also let them, the local petition, but we also asked them to come along to the event. So instead of it being like Greenpeace driven, we were making sure that it was locally driven and it was a joint relationship. Does that answer that, Lisa?
Sorry, kind of. I was just kind of from the very grassroots side of it.
Mm-hmm.
How do you actually find them on the ground initially? Was it just through a petition that they all signed for the Mackenzie, or?
Do you mean locals who are already working on the issue, or do you mean people who we wanted to bring into the local groups?
People, locals that were there, that how were you aware that they were against it? Was it just through them signing a petition for Greenpeace, or were there other methods?
So there were several methods. The key one was through getting people who had signed the Greenpeace petition and then reaching out to them. And we actually did a road trip and went around the South Island meeting a bunch of them. So it was about building relationships. Some people had got in touch with us because we had had quite a lot of media coverage. And once we go meet people, they put us in contact with other people. So it was a lot of relationship building, but the key starting point was the people who signed the petition. The interesting thing about this particular campaign is that we had heaps of people signing that campaign who were not Greenpeace supporters beforehand and wouldn't necessarily support Greenpeace campaigns, which was interesting, like the Twizel community. I think 10% of the Twizel community signed that campaign. So we were getting to build relationships with people on one key issue. It didn't mean they were going to agree with us on other things we were campaigning on, but at this point they didn't want the scheme to go ahead. And so we found where we could connect and where we had a core issue that we could work together on. So I'm just going to play, I'm going to attempt to play a little video of the protest. So the Save the Mackenzie campaign, we slowed down for a couple of years. There are some things going ahead, but the key thing was that we had heaps of people take direct action, get more involved and do more things than they had ever done before around the issue. People had upskilled, talked to the media, a bunch of people had locked on to equipment, and they took direct action that they hadn't done before, and they realized that they could actually say no to something that they weren't happy with.
There are 2 more questions. Maybe after the video.
You can ask them now if you want.
So there's 2 different ones. The first one is from Jason, and it's when a campaign involves water rights and issues which affect Tītiriti issues, do you also attempt to create relationships with local iwi? He's wondering.
Yep. So, I mean, I think all organisations could definitely be better at this. In this situation, my understanding is that we did reach out to a local iwi. We had a climate campaigner, Mike Smith, who worked closely with us and advised us. And I know when we worked on Save Te Waikato Springs campaign, we worked closely with the iwi as well. And there was another question.
Yeah, there's two more now. One's from Pat, and it's how did you get non-Greenpeace people involved?
So a lot of this came down to networking, so a lot of the people we worked with on these campaigns across the country was with people who weren't necessarily engaged with Greenpeace. We were working with people who cared about water issues in their community, and we reached out to them and built relationships with them. So it meant turning up, having heaps of meetings, listening a lot, and just networking. Also because so many people cared about some of these issues, like the Save the Mackenzie campaign or Stop Big Irrigation, that we brought in a lot of new people that way. I'm just going to play this video. Can you see my screen and it says protesters dressed as cows? Great.
Close to 100 people, some dressed as cows, took to the streets of Dunedin this afternoon to protest against plans to convert a Mackenzie Basin property into a dairy farm. The protesters mooed and chanted outside the office of Murray Valentine, who has resource consent to farm up to 5,000 dairy cows on his Simons Farm.
Here it is. They're just going to be
close to 100 people, some dressed as cows, took to the streets of Dunedin this afternoon to protest against plans to convert a Mackenzie Basin property into a dairy farm. The protesters mooed and chanted outside the office of Murray Valentine, who has resource consent to farm up to 5,000 dairy cows on his Simons Pass property. But as our Otago Southern reporter Tess Brunton reports, the protests, well, they may have come too late.
Somebody's hurting the Mackenzie and it's gone on far too long.
Adam Curry has a special connection to the unique wilderness of the Mackenzie Basin. As a child, he spent his summers camping and winter skiing in the region. Now as a protest spokesperson, he says he's fighting to keep those memories alive for future generations.
There'll be incredible amounts of fertiliser. He's going to pump thousands and thousands of water into the Mackenzie Basin, and it would just destroy the wildlife there. Would massively be, most of it would be destroyed. It would never be able to be reclaimed on public land again. In a place like the Mackenzie and the Waimak are the most inappropriate places to farm in Aotearoa. So if the consent's going to be drawn, if farming is going to start here, then when does it stop?
He says there are some areas that should not be converted to dairying.
The Octagon is no place for cows. There's a place for cows, there's a place not for cows, and the Octagon is no place for cows, and neither is the Mackenzie.
The rally was organised by Save Our Water, Otago Southland and Greenpeace, but plenty of others joined in. Forest and Bird Sue Matron spoke at the rally, saying large-scale irrigation and dairying had no place in the Mackenzie Basin.
Well, we want Mr Valentine to abide by his legal requirements and stick to the conditions that are on his consent. And we're currently working with our lawyers to make sure that that's happening, because at the moment he is being a little bit disdainful about the consents that he's got and not meeting the legal requirements that he should be doing.
After speeches, the group took to the streets, marching up the hill towards Mr Valentine's office. The protesters chanted as they climbed several flights of stairs to his office, only to discover it was locked and no one would open the door. After several attempts to find a way in, protesters left a signed letter at his door to urge him to change his plans.
I got a big board, very impressive board, which had a picture of a dairy cow on it, and messages from about, looks like 30 or 40 people.
That's Mr Valentine.
I'm just going to stop it there and go back to sharing my other screen. The thing I really like about that campaign, or the Big Irrigation campaign, is that local people took ownership because we supported them to do that. Instead of us saying, we're going to turn up, we're going to do this, it was far more impactful bringing local people in. It takes working with locals. They understand what's going on. They've got the connections. There's resources we have that we can support them to feel empowered and make change happen. Like during this campaign, we had hundreds of people occupy the ECAM building. We had, I think, over 20 people occupy that dairy site in the Mackenzie. And in Dunedin, a bunch of people who beforehand were too scared to maybe protest, talk to the media, were all of a sudden talking to the media, putting themselves on the front line because we worked with them rather than telling them what they should be doing. Does that make sense? Yeah. I'm going to go back to my other slide if I can get there. If you want to ask any questions while I do that, then go for it.
So there's another question from Liam, and that was, what type of people got involved? Was it people with no campaign experience or people that were new to this type of campaign in particular?
It was all sorts. So it was So the whole point of us building an engagement journey is ensuring that there's always people who can get involved no matter what their level of expertise are. So number one, we had to build relationships with people who are already working on these issues, but we also had all these people who, like, water is a key issue in New Zealand, right? People care about waterways. So to get them on board or signing the petition in the beginning is probably an easy step. It's then figuring out how we can get them engaged in these issues, and the way we found it to be super successful was for them to be engaged in the local issues that impacted on them, because they're happening all over the country. So it wasn't just Greenpeace people, there were farmers. We built really good relationships with the farmers. We built good relationships with environmental groups. Some people who were super supportive of this campaign met us in secret locations and didn't want us wearing Greenpeace clothes because they didn't want to be ousted in their community, but they wanted to support us and do what they could to make sure these schemes didn't go ahead. So the next part, again, and I've already touched on this a little bit, is supporting and coaching people with their campaign. So again, bringing people in to what's happening locally. This picture here is at the Hawke's Bay Regional Council, and these are a bunch of the greenie activists, I guess, who were putting, well, they were locals who didn't want this dam to go ahead. They didn't necessarily, a lot of them weren't greenie activists, some of them were, but a lot of them just didn't want the scheme to go ahead. They didn't agree with us on other things, but, yeah.
Oh, sorry, we can't see your screen.
Ah. Can you?
There we go. Yeah. Well,
can you see setup and coaching, or can you see Mackenzie?
Setup and coaching is what I see.
Great. Can you see setup and coaching now? Okay, cool. So the reason I put this picture up is because we thought we had won this scheme, and then all of a sudden the farmers decided that they were going to come along and protest against this protest. So we reached out to the community and said this was happening. Hey, we've got to get along to this council meeting. This was the middle of winter, and all the people who wanted the Ruataniwha Dam to go ahead went inside, took all the seats, and thought we wouldn't be allowed to come in. Then the media turned up. These campaigners were the main story on the front page of the newspaper the next day. There was nothing from the pro-dam group because they had all gone inside to get the warm seats. I just like that story because it's all about people power, and also these people just turning up again and again at their local council to say, actually, we really care about this and what you're doing isn't okay. And something just to touch on quickly is another key point of why I think organisations should be running distributed campaigns is because campaigning in your local community can be tiring and it can be scary. And whether that's, like at NZEI in a school, if you're the only one who's trying to get everyone to turn up to something constantly, we need to ensure that we are getting people to network and connect so they don't feel lonely and they can share the resources and they can share their experiences with each other, not just Greenpeace or NZEI telling members or supporters what they should be doing, but ensuring that we're connecting them with each other so they can support each other, especially the leaders, making sure that they know what's happening for them is probably happening in another community or in another school, so they can, learn from each other as well. Tools we used in this campaign, as I may have mentioned, and if anyone has worked with me, they know that I talk about this all the time. And we used something called Toko, which is owned by Control Shift. It's a organising platform. And in this picture, you can see that we had several campaigns running on the same issue. So instead of you know, one big campaign saying stop big irrigation. We had that running, but we also had local community campaigns running in each region that were putting pressure on their local councils. This tool can also be used, say, if you want to target local MPs, but you're still working with the overarching key issue. So again, we're putting pressure on local targets. It's far more empowering for locals to go to an MP's office rather than write a letter to someone who's sitting in the beehive, right? We need to make it as accessible as possible for people to feel like they can participate in activism. And also, when you go to these, I think a lot of the time people think that their local councillors or their local MPs are these incredibly intelligent people, but when you go along to some of these meetings, you realise people in power aren't always the smartest and most switched on people, but they have the power, they have a lot of power, and they're making heaps of decisions on behalf of you, and you have the right to ask questions and hold them accountable. A really good example of where I was super surprised was at the Huronui District Council. We went along and they were writing all the pros and cons of why they should invest in this scheme. And what the first thing somebody wrote up from one of the members was climate change. And then the councillor was like, well, there's nothing we can do about that, so I'm just going to cross that out. And I was like, you're going to invest a heap of your ratepayers' money in this scheme, and you refuse to take climate change into account. Like, these are the kind of people we need to hold responsible for their behaviour and their choices. The final thing with a distributed campaign is celebrating our wins. So it's really important when we're bringing people along, we remember the steps we've taken and the things that we've achieved. And just like at NZEI, as some of you may know, the teacher aid pay equity settlement came through last week, and now we need to talk about all the different things that have happened over the last 9 months. Like, that has only got to where it is because members fought for it. And just like the big irrigation scheme started to fall over because people stood up and actually said this isn't okay, and they took risks and they went outside their comfort zones. This picture is in a dam, and the majority of the people in this picture hadn't broken the law before. They hadn't done anything like this, but they cared enough, and we could bring them together and empower them to feel like it was okay to do this, because this is what needed to happen. We needed to start taking direct action because we had a government and local councils who were making pretty bad decisions. This is a Hawke's Bay, them standing out in the rain. That Ruataniwha scheme fell over, the Ruataniwha Dam scheme. This is a Huronui District Council community. We only needed 10 people to turn up to those meetings. Usually one person turns up. That scheme is no longer being invested. The local council is no longer investing in that scheme. The cool thing about this picture is that this community is quite conservative, and we had a really good relationship with them, but they were also super happy for Greenpeace to take a more radical activisty stance, so we could kind of connect. They could come across as a more reasonable local people, and we could come in and be a little bit more, I don't know, ruffle some feathers, and that was fine. We talked about that. It worked out well. And so some people in here were Greenpeace members, and some of these people were or Greenpeace supporters, and some were local activists who cared about the issues. The Wairarapa schemes that were going ahead, my understanding is they still haven't gone ahead, so it's another win. Local community people power. The reason I put the article on the right hand side is because the local newspapers got in touch with the campaigner through the Toko platform to reach out to them to write a story. So it wasn't just, you know, Greenpeace or a campaigner saying this is what we want. It's actually local people basically singing from the same song sheet saying we don't want this either. We want this scheme to stop and we don't want the regional council investing in it. And the reason I have Jacinda Ardern on here is because she got elected because of how people voted, and it meant that they withdrew the funding or started closing down the big irrigation fund. They stopped funding them. Most of these schemes have fallen over. So yeah, winning. Celebrate winning. So quick summary, establish a people-powered theory of change. Make sure when we're coming up with strategies that we're talking about people in the beginning, not writing a strategy and then finding a way to slot people in, because it just won't be nearly as powerful. The more we can include people in these strategies, whether it's a grassroots group or a big organization, the more I think we're going to be able to thrive and the more we're going to be able to win. We need to map it out. I don't think we should just be jumping to tactics, but looking at how we can engage different people along the journey. How can we get people who care about a water issue to turn up to something? And how do we get people who are super engaged to upskill more? And again, how do we bring people into those groups? And how do we support locals? We don't want to just put them out there and hope for the best. We need to make sure that we have the time and resources to carry on supporting them. There's heaps of online tools that exist, such as Control Shift, or you can use Facebook or whatever other social media tools, but we should be making the most of that. They're out there. The Talker one is free for people to use. Action Station have a similar one. Organizations should be financially investing in these platforms. I thought I would just plug that because there's NZEI people here. We need these tools help us run campaigns better. It helps us connect online and offline, and it helps people build power at a local level. And celebrate. We need to celebrate our wins, and we need to remind people the things we've achieved, whether it's in unions or in the grassroots movement, that we only achieved these because we worked together and we fought for it and we took risks. Yeah, the last thing is take risks, look after yourself, and you're not alone. There's other people out there, and distributed campaigns help us connect with one another who are working on the same issues. The end.
Awesome, amazing. Thank you, Sarah. Can I ask you a couple questions that for folks that popped back into this? I think there's one that has come through since you answered the last set of questions, and it's from Tim. And the question is, of the people that weren't active before but got active in this campaign, how many have gone on to be active in other campaigns? And I'm happy to speak to this too if you feel like you hit a bit of a roadblock, because I know there's also then been the transition of you moving into your new role at NZEI.
Well, I can talk about Te Waikato Springs, and then maybe you can talk more about that. So there was a campaign to save Te Waikato Springs, which is just out in a few hours from Nelson. And we worked with a local campaigner, and we gave him lots of support and guidance in his first campaign. He's gone on to, I think, run a couple more campaigns, and now that he has heaps of community support, and he carries on doing lots of different things. So at that level, I think it's been pretty impactful. Abby.
Yeah, so in terms of the people that got engaged in, say, like the Save the Mackenzie and the irrigation scheme campaigns, so there are quite a few people that have gone on. And I would say well over 50% have continued to stay involved. I think, you know, Sarah was mentioning the people's real passion for the particular issue, getting them involved. And so, and say Save the Mackenzie, and Sarah and I actually went on a road trip together down that she had organized down around the South Island, meeting with some Greenpeace supporters, but also just setting up platforms for people in the community to come talk about the Save the Mackenzie campaign. And we saw so many people that hadn't, like she said, hadn't been really actively involved in Greenpeace campaigns before, but were really passionate because the Mackenzie country was in their backyard. And so I mean, for me personally, as somebody who works in mobilization, it was a real eye-opener in terms of recognizing that there are people that will be involved in all of the Greenpeace campaigns because they are just across the board passionate about everything that the organization does, and work with lots of different allies on any kind of environmental issue because they're passionate. But there are people that their motivation and the thing that really starts lighting that fire under their feet is something that they feel is really personal to them. And Mackenzie Country Campaign was that for a lot of people. And so because it was that, I think there are some people that haven't been as closely involved since. But I also want to say that there was a bit, to be fair, there was a bit of a gap in our agriculture work last year because as an organization, Greenpeace New Zealand focused really heavily on the oil campaign and targeted OMV, which meant that the agriculture work didn't have the same kind of prominence as 2018. So I think a lot of people kind of got quieter with our work in part because we weren't talking about agriculture so much, and that was the thing that had gotten them through the door. That's changing now in 2020, and we're really ramping up agriculture again, and it's a big campaign for us this year, and especially the regen ag stuff in relation to the COVID response work and wanting that to be a big part of where the government invests money. So I think some of those people are starting to come on board now. We're actually going specifically to those irrigation scheme and Mackenzie Country audiences and wanting to kind of emotionally engage them more. So yeah, some of them fell off, but I think that was also in part because the story got quiet, and that was the story that had motivated them. So that was, you know, something that we could have prevented had we not focused on oil so much, but it was also just strategically what made the most sense for us last year. So now we're just trying to get them back a little bit and just doing a little bit of extra work to do that. But it did also, like Sarah speaking about the folks that did the sit-in at ECAN or did one of the protests at Mackenzie Country, a lot of those people that saw how empowering participating in peaceful civil disobedience or local government decision process the decision-making process was, they stayed involved because it was the thing like, oh, this is actually really empowering and this makes a difference. So they have now, every time we go down to their region, they come to everything. They're involved in everything. Doesn't matter what the campaign is, because that really showed them how powerful it can be to get out there. So.
And also, just because we don't, or the organisation doesn't see necessarily what they're doing, if we put time and effort into upskilling them, then they can still use it locally in other ways. And I think that's really important, not just getting them engaged in that particular issue. How do we empower them to feel like they can keep campaigning without us at sometimes if they're how do we keep them campaigning and putting pressure on decision makers, whether that's corporate or if it's government? We want them to feel like they can, you know, turn up to local meetings and ask questions about the thing they care about, or get in touch with supermarkets who aren't doing something and saying something appropriate and saying, hey, this is not okay, like you should pay your workers better, or whatever it is. I'm just reading Stephanie's questions. I think this might be controversial. I think that there is always local targets. So I think distributed campaigning generally would have national targets, but there's a way that we can empower people at a local level. So for instance, in the ECE campaign, maybe we could run I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I'll say it anyway. If we ran like a corporate campaign, we could put pressure on some of the boards who are making decisions, because in the ECE private sector, there's a bunch of people who are profiting heaps at the expense of children. So there are local targets, and we can do that, whether that is connecting online or people turning up to their local MPs, or people turning up to the chairs of Evolve and saying, actually, what are you guys doing? Like, you're treating workers like minions. You're cutting their pay, you're not giving them the basic rights they deserve, and we should hold them accountable for that. There's always local targets, and the more we have local targets, the more we can find local targets, I think the more we're going to empower people and get them involved in the issues. If we just target nationally, we're not going to be able to get that same engagement. Judith, I don't know if, can you elaborate on what you mean by quantify time in terms of taking time to build relationships?
I was going to say, Judith, feel free to unmute if you want to ask your question verbally, if you want to add that clarity verbally.
Well, I'll have a go at answering it.
Okay.
I mean, for me, I think measuring things, not just in, say, at NZA, yes, we want 1,000 people to join, but also how many of those people do we want to become leaders? Or how many of those people do we want them to take more action than just turning up to a union meeting? Like, how do we, I think we need to quantify different levels of engagement and how we're constantly getting people to do something slightly outside their comfort zone.
There's another question, which is, oh, sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I'm not losing.
I like Jason's comment. I was going to show a picture of Donald Trump and the Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, because I've been telling people, particularly women lately, that when you feel insecure, just keep in mind that if you're the President of the USA or you're the Prime Minister of the UK right now, you would be doing a better job. So yeah, feel comfortable to take people on and ask questions, because you could do those roles better than the current people in those positions.
So I think there's another question. I'm just trying to see which ones are comments and which ones are questions. So Stephanie says, do you think it's in terms of the role the larger organizations play in sustaining distributed campaigns? I think this is what is in relation to, but just clarify if I'm incorrect, Stephanie, is do you think it's a combination of upskilling but also going beyond your comfort zone, that first act of courage that then somehow creates a psychological barrier that you've broken? So I guess it's but then also comparing that to the power of people being connected digitally across brands?
Sorry, what I was sort of saying was that we often talk about upskilling people, but sometimes I don't think it's really a matter of skill. I think it's that psychological step. You know, the first time you talk to the media, or the first time you feel you represent somebody else, or the first time you get arrested, or the first time, you know, like there's some psychological thing. You know, like I remember the first time I got threatened with arrest when I tried to hit a policeman with an umbrella in a protest when I was 17, you know. And so that for me was like, because I've been brought up to be very compliant in a funny sort of a way. I mean, my parents are quite progressive in their thinking, but they're also compliant, you know. So, and then I remember like the first time we did a campaign at NZEI, and the president at the time came with me on this bus tour, which wasn't like naughty, but she said to me, I've never asked anybody to sign a petition before. And I was like, where have you been all your life? So like, but it was a real, it wasn't Judith, it was a real, and it just struck me that like for some people it's like play centre or something, you know, like play centre is an experience that puts them on a pathway because they get involved with a community organisation for the first time. For some people, it can be any issue, but there's some sort of psychological barrier that once you've broken it, it's like that thing you said, Sarah, of like, you could be as good as Trump. You just have to believe that you can do it. And so I'm not sure that, I think skills are important, but people, it's kind of like, you know, you don't have to be a mathematician to have a informed view of the economy or something, you know, like it's actually a psychological barrier as much as a skill barrier.
I totally agree, Stephanie. I think I see roles of big organizations to support people to feel empowered to do that. When I say upskill, I don't think necessarily it's a skill, it's empowering people to feel like they can do that and taking them along that journey. and making sure it's a good experience, because they do realize once they do that that they can do it again. You know, talking in front of the media is super scary, but if you do it a couple of times, it's actually not that bad. So how do we support people to do a little bit more than they're currently doing? I saw something about local support. I think it's really important, like either organizations, or if you don't have a larger organization, to find ways to connect, whether that's like monthly meetings or something like that, where you can share those resources. Big orgs can help facilitate that to happen. But I think also just reaching out to people who care about the same thing. So a lot of my job at Greenpeace was just Facebooking all the plastic groups and saying, hey, I'm Sarah, what are you doing? How can I support you? Or like, not what are you doing, but you know, I see you're working on this. This sounds really cool. We can share these resources with you. Or did you know this group over there is also working on that? Have you guys connected? And a lot of the time they haven't connected, but they're fighting the same fight. So it's just bringing all these people, I guess, together to be more effective in their campaigns. And that's why I'm such an advocate of distributed campaigning, because you see it's super effective when you have a good strategy and you build people into that strategy.
I'm going to jump in because it's 1 minute until 5. So we need to wrap up, but there might be some questions that got missed in the chat. So we'll look back through it and make sure that nothing was missed. And if something was missed, then we'll make sure to email it to Sarah so that she can answer it for you. So sorry if we weren't able to get to your question today. There was lots of good conversation happening in the chat, so I fear I might have missed one as it was all coming through. But thank you so much, Sarah. That was amazing. And it just reminds me of how good you are at running distributed campaigns and how much I miss working with you. Thank you so much for joining us on your Saturday long weekend.
And nice to see so many of your faces that I haven't seen in ages, like Jenny, Jason, Lisa.
Yeah, it's cool. It's good activist friend hangouts on Saturdays. I love them. Cool. So I just want to close by thanking you all again for sharing your time and energy today. And we very much look forward to working with you in the future, whether it's on Zoom or on a distributed campaign, and maybe even face-to-face. Thank you so much. Kia ora koutou. Have a fantastic Saturday evening, everybody. Bye.
Thanks so much, Abby. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Sarah.